Hi, thanks for coming out. My name is Aaron Russell. This is the Smith Family Foundation debate series. Tonight's event is the politics of science. Next month, we have a debate on the Iraq situation. It's called Should We Stay or Should We Go? It features General William Odom, professor at Yale University, debating Peter Brooks, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Tonight we have Mr. Nicholas Wade moderating. Mr. Wade was born in England. He received a BA in Natural Sciences from Eton at King's College, Cambridge. He worked for Nature magazine, a weekly scientific magazine based in London, from 1967 to 71. In 1971, he joined the new staff of Science, a weekly scientific journal published in DC. In 1982, he became a member of the editorial board of the New York Times, writing editorials on science, health, the environment, and military technology. He was science editor of the Times from 1990 to 96 and has been a science reporter at the Times since 1997. He's authored several books, including The Ultimate Experiment, The Noble Duel, Betrayers of Truth, A World Beyond Healing, and Life Script. He has a book coming out in April called Before the Dawn, Recovering the Lost History of Our Ancestors. It promises to synthesize recent scientific findings that shed new light on our history of our ancient ancestors and the evolution of human nature. Quote, expecting much attention, says BuzzGirl.com, who is a publishing insider who gets the skinnies on tomorrow's bestseller. He lives with his wife Mary and 2 children in Montclair, New Jersey. Please welcome Mr. Nicholas Wade.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Well, we'll go straight to our 3 speakers who are going to lead us through the highways and byways of science and government and how the two intersect. Our first speaker is Chris Mooney, who is a correspondent for Seed magazine and for a correspondent for American Prospect, but he may be better known to you for an excellent book he's recently published called The Republican War on Science, whose title explains the contents. Chris Mooney.
Thanks. As I reflect on my recent experiences writing and speaking about the relationship between politics and science, my appreciation deepens for the Donald and Paula Smith Family Foundation. Science policy is not an area where we have much real dialogue between those on different sides of the aisle. But with this event, you've helped create such a dialogue. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, but you've definitely brought the monster to life. So before I begin my talk and introduce the central arguments of the book, I just want to thank Donald and Paula Smith for their intellectual seriousness and for hosting this great event. And I'd also like to thank the panelists, our moderator, Aaron Russell, for organizing everything, and all of you for coming. On the morning of December 29th, 2004, President George W. Bush did something unusual. He took questions from reporters at a press conference. It was Bush's first public address following the tsunami catastrophe that devastated India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and other nations. Before long, the president was asked a question that he didn't have any idea how to answer. Did the United States have a warning system in place for the purpose of detecting tsunamis? This was the president's response.
Yeah, I just have to look into it. That's a very legitimate question. I presume that we are in pretty good shape. I think our location in the world is such that we may be less vulnerable than other parts, but I am not a geologist, as you know, and but I think it's a very legitimate question.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, but I'd like to focus on one thing in particular that Bush said, quote, "I'm not a geologist, as you know." With these words, President Bush, in his accidental wisdom, perfectly stated just how important reliable scientific information is to a modern, technologically advanced democracy like our own. Today in America, we don't demand that our political leaders master all the complexities of science. True, there are exceptions like physicist Rush Holt, who represents Princeton, New Jersey. In Congress, his constituents drive around with bumper stickers reading, "My congressman is a rocket scientist." But that's hardly the norm. It's not what we expect of all politicians. But what we do expect, and where Bush hardly inspired confidence in the wake of the tsunami, is that our democratically elected leaders will establish strong channels of communication between themselves and scientists so that policymaking will be well informed. Just think of all the political issues today where decisions rely, at least in part, upon accurate scientific knowledge. Bioterrorism, therapeutic cloning, hurricane protection, whether Iraq's aluminum tubes were meant for centrifuges, drugs and sports, genetically modified foods, global warming, sex education, how to avert a global influenza pandemic, whether to drill for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. On all these issues and on many, many others, our nation needs reliable scientific knowledge to filter into policymaking, and if it doesn't, it's a safe bet that bad, wrong-headed, and even dangerous decisions will result. And that's why we're now facing a crisis. A huge gulf has opened between today's Republican political leaders in the Bush administration, but also in Congress, and the leaders of science in America. It's an alarming divide that threatens public health, threatens the environment, it even threatens respect for knowledge itself in our society. How did this happen? Well, I believe that the current crisis of our politics and science requires a political explanation. Today's conservative Republicans who are running our government at the present time have ignored or distorted widely accepted scientific research repeatedly across a range of areas. In almost every case, the decision to ignore or distort broadly accepted scientific conclusions can be traced or seems to spring from an attempt to appease special interest groups, whether in industry or on the Christian political right. The strategy plays out in several areas of public policy. First, there are the issues that concern corporate America, including global warming, mercury pollution, endangered species protections, many others. In each of these areas, we've seen Republicans ignore or distort science, presumably to appease their supporters in industry. But there's a whole different constellation of issues as well: evolution, embryonic stem cell research, the health risks or lack thereof of abortion, sex education, condom effectiveness, Plan B emergency contraception, the so-called morning after pill. These are the issues that count to the religious supporters of the Republican Party. And again, we've seen Republicans ignore or distort science to appease this key slice of their political base as well. Now, to be fair, not every Republican is guilty, and the political misuse of science has also occurred on the left. Animal rights activists and environmentalists have been charged with pushing positions that have little scientific foundation. There have been accusations about the hyping of embryonic stem cell research. In at least some instances, I believe these charges are valid, but the Republican right's willingness to ignore or distort widely accepted scientific research is now affecting so many important areas and has grown so prominent in political life that I believe there's no serious comparison between the different sides. It's not that the political left is innocent when it comes to misusing science, it's just that today, and this may change, but for now, the political right is much more guilty. In closing, let me discuss one prominent issue briefly where this is playing out. Perhaps the most prominent, because I'm referring to evolution, where today's proponents of intelligent design are quite literally trying to undermine the very nature of science itself. These intelligent design creationists argue that science is biased because it relies exclusively upon natural explanations rather than considering supernatural causes for phenomena. It's funny because I always thought this was a strength of science. When we hear thunder, we no longer think it means the gods are angry. When we see an epileptic, we no longer think the person is demonically possessed. To me, this sounds like progress. But today's intelligent design proponents want to turn modern scientists into something much more akin to Ghostbusters. They are apparently to engage in speculative, aimless pursuit of the supernatural. I think you can see why the intelligent design people want to redefine science in this way to include supernatural causes, it's because by the standards of modern science, not only do they not have a theory, but they don't even have a hunch. They're postulating an unknown designer who meddles in the history of life for no apparent reason and whose actions aren't subject to any kind of test. And here's one thing that they really can't explain, which is that if the designer is so powerful, why all the tinkering? Why couldn't he, she, or it get it right the first time? So intelligent design utterly fails as science. Even a federal judge, himself a moderate Republican, recently recognized this, but no matter. The teaching of intelligent design in public school science classes has been supported by the Senate Majority Leader as well as the President of the United States. So I'll just leave you with this thought. Evolution presents a clear case of why Republicans and their political allies, in this case on the Christian right, are a lot worse right now when it comes to attacking science. Last I checked, there weren't any Democrats demanding that we use our high schools to, quote, teach the controversy over plate tectonics, relativity, or the germ theory of disease. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, for that very enlightening overview. Our next speaker is Ronald Bailey. Ronald is a science correspondent for Reason magazine, and he is the author of a book called Liberation Biology, which looks at the ethical problems with stem cells, therapeutic cloning, longer life, and other important issues raised by our new biological knowledge. Ron. Okay.
First of all, I also want to thank Donald and Paula Smith for organizing this fabulous series of speaking events, and my fellow panelists for showing up to debate these very important issues. I guess by the way, I'm in no way, shape, or form going to contradict what Chris said about the Bush administration. They are and have been somewhat ham-fisted, shall we say, in their misuse and abuse of science. But they're not the only ones, is the problem. And I think that Chris is being a little more gentle with people on the left than they possibly deserve. And I'll try to explain that a little bit. But I guess the question we're here to address is science politicized? And I think a better question might be, when was it ever not politicized? I mean, we can begin, of course, with the famous case of Galileo and the persecution the church visited upon him. And then, of course, a more recent case that most of you probably don't know about, but we'll get to in a bit, is the example of the Environmental Protection Agency's decision to ban the pesticide DDT in 1972, even though there was 9,000 pages of scientific data and testimony, and a EPA hearing administrator's report that basically concluded that the pesticide should not be banned. But we'll get to that in a minute. But why do we worry about science so much in this day and age? Why is it so critical to us? A friend and a colleague of mine has written a wonderful book called Kindly Inquisitors, where he describes basically the three pillars of our Enlightenment society and upon which our Enlightenment society stands. And those are democracy, capitalism, and what he calls liberal science. Democracy is how we determine who gets to wield power, coercive power legitimately. Capitalism is how we decide who gets what in the Enlightenment society. And what he calls liberal science is how we determine what is true or not. And what he means by liberal science is everything from is essentially free speech. It's everything from activist pamphlets, the most egregious activist pamphlets, to our peer-reviewed scientific journals today. And it's a society-wide process of continual critique of everything that's out there in the public square, and that includes science. And it's absolutely vital that we keep that going, and that we not censor it, and that the information be constantly made transparent to everyone. And the reason that science is so critical now is because the authority of the church and the state and other sort of expert bodies from which received wisdom and authority once came has dissipated in the modern secular age. And so now everybody on the left or the right desperately want to say, the data say that my policy, my pet proposal needs to be supported. And therefore science says we must do this. And so this is why, unfortunately, I would conclude that science is forever politicized. But I think there's hope for how, again, I think the process of liberal science that I was describing is the way out. Let's take a few examples. Of course, one of the things that the basis of this politicization is that the federal government spends $132 billion a year on research and development. And this is money that, of course, the Congress, that everybody who works for the government and all the citizens will have some interest in seeing it distributed. This immediately implies politics. There's no getting around that. I'd like to ask the audience here, let's go through some examples. Who was the first president to ban federal funding of embryonic research? That's right, Bill Clinton. In 1994, he overruled the National Institutes of Health's federal embryo panel's recommendation that this research go forward. And he did it, again, possibly to appease the people on the right, the people who were involved with the abortion debate. That's politics. Physicist William Happer, who was, he's now at Princeton University, was fired from the Department of Energy because he had recommended that the department fund a series of monitors to check where the trends in ozone depletion were going. Vice President Al Gore thought this was an attack on his policy, the support of Montreal Ozone Depletion Treaty, and had him fired. So this has happened before. Now, we've heard a little bit about the Plan B controversy, and I won't go into that in great detail, but I'm also concerned about other issues that are coming up. For example, recently, a couple of pharmaceutical companies have approached the FDA to have vaccines for human papillomavirus approved. This would prevent thousands of cases of cervical cancer in women every year, and already people on the right wing, for example, Dr. Hal Wallace, who works for Focus on the Family, is very concerned about this because he's afraid that if we started giving this vaccine to children, and there's a lot of scientific data that giving it to young girls early on would be a much more effective way of controlling the spread of the disease, that it might encourage them to be promiscuous later on because they would feel protected against sexually transmitted diseases. Of course, I can hardly wait to see what arguments he would bring out when we finally have an HIV vaccine. In any case, and the thing today, one of the big issues today that we've been embroiled in for the last year, of course, is the debate over intelligent design. And I got to spend some time this summer with another group of people at Liberty University called the Creation Mega Conference. These people believe that the intelligent design people are wimps. They think that, in fact, the Earth was created 6,000 years ago and that Noah saved several thousand species of dinosaurs. And they have a lot of people arguing about this. But the reason I bring them up in this context is because actually their numbers are much larger than the people who are supporting the specious theory of intelligent design. But it gets to the cultural problem. Why are these people so concerned about it? Do they really care about fossils? Do they really care about protein cascades in the blood? The answer is no. You sit down with them, you talk to them, what they're really concerned about is they're afraid that their children will go to hell and that science will lead the way. That essentially they will lose their faith because evolutionary biology implies to them a philosophical materialism, which is not the case. It doesn't necessarily do that. And so this debate is not going to go away. I suspect, assuming that intelligent design continues to lose in the courts and the legislatures and so forth, that it will be repackaged and the same cultural impulse will continue to grow over time. We're not going to get rid of that debate. And then a more concerning thing. Today, I was just reading online, the Baltimore Sun has an article basically looking at the FDA. And there's some new proposals now emanating from the left that the FDA start considering ethical concerns and values in its drug approval process. As you know, the FDA is supposed to approve of drugs on the basis of quality, safety, and efficacy. Those are scientific, hard data. And instead now we have the Pew Center for Food and Biotechnology. They want the FDA to consider ethical concerns in its regulation of genetically modified animals and cloned animals, for example. Daniel Callahan from the Hastings Center, the former founder of the Hastings Center, one of the world's first bioethics think tanks, says that the FDA should consider expensive drugs. If the drug is too expensive, even if it's safe and effective, it should not be allowed. And I'm very worried about this model, if you will, because we have a model abroad of this kind of regulatory agency that includes values. It's called the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority in Great Britain. And basically, this agency can overrule families' values in regard to their reproductive health. And a quick example of that. There was a family, they had 5 children in Scotland. Unfortunately, their youngest child, a daughter, died in a fire at age 3. And they wanted to go and use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis with sex selection to have another little girl. They thought their family could be, I'll be finished in a moment, would have their family completed by having another little girl. They didn't think they were going to replace, unfortunately, the dead child. They just thought that would be a good thing. And the HFEA said flat out, no, you may not do that. They substituted their values for the values of the parents in this case, and I don't think we want regulatory agencies doing that. Fortunately, the family had another choice. They could go to, if you will, to Italy. They went to Italy and in fact used PGD and had a little girl. So in conclusion, science is going to be political. The science wars are with us for always. William Ruckelshaus, the guy who actually banned DDT, basically said, and I quote, decisions by the government involving the use of toxic substances are political with a small p. The ultimate judgment remains political. And what was true for the EPA in 1972 remains true for federal agencies today. And the science wars are going to be here to stay, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron, for a very thoughtful talk. So our next speaker is Wesley Smith. He is an attorney. He is the author of 11 books, the most recent of which is The Culture of Death, and the two most recent of which are The Culture of Death and The Power Over Pain. And he's a fellow of the Discovery Institute. Is that in Washington or in?
In Washington, maybe.
In Washington.
I'm not.
Okay. Okay.
I want to thank everybody for coming to this event and for the opportunity to share my views with you. It's quite an opportunity to be with Nicholas Wade of the New York Times and noted public intellectuals like Chris Mooney and Ron Bailey. I bring you greetings from California, where I have just escaped a tsunami-type flood. My governor can beat up your governor. You know, too often in these contentious times and with these contentious issues, people with differing views talk past each other instead of talk to each other. And I don't think that's good for a free country or a democratic society. And so I really believe that what the Smith Foundation, and it's a great last name, by the way, what the Smith Foundation is doing with this series of debates is quite impressive and quite important. And I would like to see this idea spread around the country so that we can get back to debating instead of yelling at each other. Most of the issues that we will be discussing tonight are not really about science debates. They are moral and ethical debates. Science cannot tell us right from wrong. It can tell us facts, and I think that was mentioned in some of the earlier presentations. But it cannot tell us truth, and by that I mean truth with a capital T. I quite agree with Chris Mooney when we have to have an informed science so that we can come to ethical conclusions and moral conclusions, and that's I think one of the most important purposes of science. It's certainly not the only purpose of science, but I think it is a very important purpose of science. I also agree with Ron Bailey that science is politicized, but science policy is politicized, but science itself should not be politicized. And unfortunately, I feel in today's day and age, the scientists are becoming politicians. And that is bad for science, because when the scientists start engaging in spin and hype, then you are actually corroding the essence of science, which should be the objective search for facts. And I don't see that in a lot of the debates that we're having today, at least the debates in which I'm engaged. Some are beginning to view science, in fact, almost in mystical terms. We hear assertions of the coming physical immortality and of humans gaining godlike powers. For example, biologist Lee Silver of Princeton, I believe, exemplifies this thinking. Writing in his book, Remaking Eden, Silver predicted that the wonders of human redesign will eventually lead us to what he called a special point, where our posterity will create themselves into a, quote, special group of mental beings who are as different from humans as humans are from primitive worms. Intelligence will not do justice to their cognitive abilities. Knowledge does not explain the depth of their understanding. power is not strong enough to describe the control they have over technologies that can be used to shape the universe in which they live. And today, children in Africa are dying of the measles. We're in danger of transforming science from a means into an end, a belief system rather than a method. I think one of the most of the issues we will be discussing tonight, actually there are two questions that I think are brought up by the issues we'll be discussing tonight. One is, what does it mean to be human? That is something that is now before the floor because of new advances in biotechnology, bioengineering, and so forth. And secondly, and I think more profoundly, and I think it is the most important question of the 21st century in many ways, is does it matter whether a life is human? Does human life matter just because it's human? It's an important question. It is being brought to bear on issues such as cloning, assisted suicide, bioengineering, and so forth. Does life have intrinsic value simply and merely because it is human? It's a question to ponder and a question to think about. The philosophy of this country certainly says that it does. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the most, I think, important sentence in the history of the human race, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. He was a deist at most. I found out from Ron Bailey today that the University of Virginia was the first purely secular university in the United States, and I think that's a wonderful thing that Thomas Jefferson considered that. And what Thomas Jefferson wrote is basically saying that there's no such thing as them, there's only us. Now, certainly in this country, we have not lived up to the promise and the stirring idealism of Thomas Jefferson's sentence. But it has impacted the world and continues to. And in this country, we are doing away with distinctions, invidious distinctions based on race, and invidious distinctions based on sex. And we are trying and desperately seeking to achieve the point where each and every single one of us is understood to have equal intrinsic moral worth. But you cannot achieve that end unless we also understand ethically that human life matters simply and merely because it's human. And there are many among us today who would answer no to the question that I posed: does life have intrinsic value simply because it's human? And in my view, to say no to that question is to turn our back on universal human rights. Because then whether a human being has value depends on who has the power to decide. It becomes political. And so we see in the animal liberation movement, and I'm not talking about animal welfare, animal liberation. Animal welfare says people have the right to use animals for human welfare and human well-being, but we also have an obligation to treat them humanely and properly, which of course we do because we are moral beings. We are the only known moral beings in the universe. We are the only known conscious beings in the universe. Whether that is a result of creation, intelligent design, or evolution is of no consequence to me. What matters is universal human rights and equality, and it requires an objective view of human life and its value. So the animal liberation movement says it is not being human that gives value, it is the ability to feel pain. And so you will see many animal liberationists actually equating a leather couch to the human lampshades of Auschwitz. And this was the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA's advocacy campaign called Holocaust on Your Plate. And that is not only denigrating to the horrors of the Holocaust, but it is diminishing of the value of human life. In bioethics, we are beginning to see a belief not in that human life matters, but that, quote, personal life matters. If one is a, quote, person, it's called Personhood Theory. And under this view, if you do not have sufficient cognitive capacities, you are not deemed a person, and therefore you have less rights. You may not have the right to life. You may not have the right to bodily integrity. Who are the human so-called non-persons? All embryos, of course, because they're not self-aware over time. They're not able to be held morally accountable for actions. Embryos, at least at the early stage, don't even have any neural cells. But so are fetuses not deemed persons for the same reasons, nor are newborn infants for the same reasons, which is why Peter Singer of Princeton University says that parents should have a year within which to keep or kill their newborn babies. People like Terry Shavo are not deemed persons, which is why some in bioethics and other transplant medicine are suggesting that we be able to harvest organs from people in persistent vegetative states. These, if we turn away from Thomas Jefferson's belief system, if we turn away from the philosophy of the United States, then we are in danger of unleashing upon ourselves a reversal of the progress we have made towards universal human equality, and that would be a tragic consequence. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for that talk. We're now going to have a discussion among the panelists, and I think the first issue that I would like for us all to explore is the question of scientific authority, the question of whether scientists should be on top or on tap. I have the impression from Chris that he feels, if I'm perhaps caricaturing his position, that once scientists have spoken, then the government should salute and execute whatever policy the scientists have said, whereas to go to the other extreme, Wes has suggested that we've raised science up to be too great an authority, and in fact the other considerations, including moral ones, are more important. So, Ron is perhaps somewhere in between. So could I ask Chris perhaps to define a little more just what limits you feel should be placed on scientific authority?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it sounds like you characterize my view as being the one that says that scientists should be on top. I think they should be on tap. What that means is that scientists should be available for policymakers so that they can provide expertise in an area where they have expertise, and the policymaker can consult that expertise and then go on to make a decision in which science is only one component of the decision. And when the policymaker has to make a decision, there are moral and ethical components, there may be economic components, there may be other components like, I already took this stance, so now I can't take a new stance because it'll contradict it and people will slam me for that. So there's all sorts of things that go into political decision making, science being only one element of that. That's my position on that. But what we should never do is we should never distort or twist the science in order to justify a preconceived policy position. That's what I'm against, and that's what I'm opposing.
Well, Chris, could I press you a little bit on that by observing that one can distinguish between two different kinds of science. One is textbook science, the stuff in the textbooks that's been pretty well checked out and you can rely on it. And the other is science at the frontiers, the new experiments that have just been reported. Most of those tend to be contradicted by the next experiment, and it takes a long time for scientists to sort of sort out what's good and what's bad. So for policymakers, when you get an issue, say, like global warming, I'm not quite sure where to place that. It's definitely not quite a fully textbook subject, but nor is it all frontier stuff. But if you put it somewhere in the middle, then don't policymakers have a right to overrule scientific committees, at least to some extent?
Sure. Policymakers shouldn't overrule scientific committees on what the findings of science are. Policymakers may overrule scientific committees in the sense that they take the scientific advice from the committee and then make a decision that is not what is implied or entailed by the scientific advice. That's their prerogative as policymakers. I mean, what your question really poses, I think, is the fact that there's always uncertainty in science, and sometimes policymakers have to make a decision when not all of the evidence is in. In fact, sometimes all of the evidence is never in. And so what they have to do is they have to try their best to sample what the best available knowledge is at the time, and for this they need science advice. They need institutionalized science advice like Congress's Office of Technology Assessment, which was destroyed by the Gingrich Republicans. They try to figure out what the best state of the science is at the time. They use that as a basis for their decision. The decision will also include other factors, ethical and so forth. But then, of course, the decision should be open to revision if, for some reason we suddenly find out that global warming isn't happening. Global warming is an example that I don't think fits because it is actually very clear that it's happening and there's not really much doubt about this. But there are other areas where the science is characterized by much more uncertainty. Nevertheless, sometimes you need to make a decision quickly because if you don't, the problem could get worse. But you should always leave open the possibility that the science changes, the decision needs to be revisited.
Okay. So, Ron, could I ask you for your views on scientific authority and what restraints or control there should be over science?
I guess, again, I think they should be on tap, not on top. The problem I have, though, is that a lot of scientists anymore, for example, in the global warming debate, have become partisans as well. I mean, they do good scientific research, but the fact of the matter is that they also then seem to plump for in their public statements, and as citizens they're allowed to do that, but they do, if you will, don the white robes of science to say, well, we should definitely use mitigation strategies, say, in order to correct global warming, as opposed to possibly using adaptation strategies. And these are actually policy debates in an economic and ethical realm in a way where they won't have any more authority than anyone else on this panel would have, and probably less, because they might not understand economics as well. So I often hear them commenting. I've been to several of the UN Conference of the Party meetings for global warming negotiations, and have talked to people quite extensively in these areas. And what you see is a policy push in one direction or another that doesn't seem to be based on the authority. You know, they want to say, listen to me, I am a scientist, when they're also making policy pronouncements they may not be qualified to make in that regard. If I may also just make one other comment, take a moment here. I think, with all due respect, that Mr. Smith here has made a category mistake. Let's face it, political equality is not based on biological equality. It never was based on biological equality. In the whole of human history, when biology never changed, we had, after all, purdah and slavery and tyranny, and that was the human norm. What changed was not our biology, but our politics. And of course, we find that sexism and racism are going away, not because our biology changed, but because our understanding of that, of our political rights has changed over time. So somehow or other, basing political equality on biology is just a philosophical mistake.
Well, so Wes, could I ask you first to respond to the question of
Sure.
whether we want scientists on tap or on top, and then if you wish to defend yourself against Rodney Meaders.
My gratuitous attack, no.
I think, of course, that's the ideal. And I agree with Ron that what is happening too often now in the public debate is that scientists are coming into Congress or into the public square wearing their science coats, trying to give themselves the authority of science, and then they act as a special interest or as advocates. We also, for example, look at the National Academy of Sciences. They issued an ethical guideline for use in embryonic stem cell research and human cloning, therapeutic human cloning. And everybody was saying, well, now the scientists have told us what the ethics are. Well, that's not the job of scientists. And if you take a look at what and I'm not saying, of course, scientists should have ideas about ethics, but when we're talking about morality and ethics, it seems to me that the corner barber has as much right to an opinion as the highest PhD. And if you take a look at what these ethical guidelines that were issued by the National Academy of Sciences said, they said that not only could leftover embryos from IVF be used that are going to be thrown out anyway, that was what we were told in 2001 was what the scientists wanted, the leftover embryos. But now we could, according to the National Academy of Sciences ethical guideline, we could actually create embryos through fertilization for use and destruction and research. And we could create human cloned embryos for use and destruction and research. Well, why should we pay any attention to what the NAS says about that any more than we should anybody else? Because that's not a science issue, that's an ethical and moral issue. They certainly we should listen to their opinions, of course, but they're just opinions. They're not truth with a capital T, and they're not facts. With regard to my statement, of course, our biology hasn't changed, but I do think that if we do not have the idea that being human is what gives us rights, without having to justify it, then whether somebody has more rights or less rights, we'll start reverting back to the bad old days, where if you had dark skin, you were not deemed a person under Dred Scott. Right now, there are people who are saying that people such as Terri Schiavo are not persons, because of her terrible cognitive incapacities that she suffered, persistent vegetative state, if that was her condition, and it's certainly a reasonable belief that that was her condition. And that, therefore, we have some science journals and some medical journals. For example, The Lancet has argued, some doctors in The Lancet have argued that we should redefine death to include a diagnosis of persistent vegetative state. This is volume 350, November 1st, 1997, a bunch of doctors, which I won't name, writing for the International Forum for Transplant Ethics, quote, "If the legal definition of death were to be changed to include comprehensive irreversible loss of higher brain function, it would be possible to take the life of a patient, or more accurately, to stop the heart, since the patient would be defined as dead."
I think we're getting into a little too much detail.
Well, the devil is in the details. But all right, we are in danger, I believe, of moving back to the idea that some humans can be oppressed based on their intrinsic or inherent characteristics. And if we go that route, then who has value and who doesn't have value once again becomes who has the ability and the political power to decide.
All right, well, let's have another round. Unless any of the panelists would like to comment specifically on what any of the others said, may I suggest that we have a brief round on the question that Wes raised of what does it mean to be human, and specifically, what relative weight should we give to the scientific view of what it means to be human versus the moral or religious view? And I guess these things do come into conflict over the stem cell debate. But let me just state that in the case for understanding the human condition in scientific terms surely grows all the stronger. He said, I'd like Wes to respond to this. As we've sequenced the human genome, we can read the precise code that tells a cell how to organize itself and an embryo how to organize itself. I mean, in a way, you could say there is or will soon be a complete scientific description of a human being, just as we have already attained or about to attain of a bacteria. But on the other hand, many people would find that view alien, and I think would listen very carefully to the moral description of the human condition. So, and this is why we find it so hard to balance the two things when it comes to issues like stem cells. So if each speaker would care to address those issues, but just hitting the highlights, I think, because of our time constraint.
That's
Would you
right.
like to go first, Chris?
Yeah. Scientifically, I don't I thought you said me.
I'm sorry. I meant to say Chris,
No, you can
not Wes.
skip me. I'm not really, here
Oh.
to give an opinion on what it means to be human. I mean, I think that's a big philosophical question. I'm here to talk about the problem when people who have a particular view about, they're pro-life, for example, they're entitled to that view. That is a moral position. But then what they're not entitled to do is distort science to claim that abortion has health risks for women that it doesn't have, for example, or distort science in other ways on the embryonic stem cell issue so that they can denigrate embryonic stem cell research. That's the problem. I mean, I'm not really...
How has science been distorted on the embryonic stem cell issue, specifically?
Well, but let's have
right,
you and Don address these issues. Then I think
Happy to tell you about
I'd like
that.
Chris to talk about government, because that's what he's mostly interested in, and then we can engage each other. So well, let me start with Don. Tell me what relative weight should we give to the scientific and to the moral view of the human condition?
Well, let's face it, the scientific information helps us define over time what human beings are in some sense or other. Let's consider two quick examples, very quick examples, one of which is, of course, the case of brain death. It was thought, in fact, when Christian Barnard first did the first heart transplant, there were people who were arguing that he had murdered someone to take their heart to give it to somebody else. And of course, over time, we came to understand that the actual person is no longer there if they don't have a functioning brain. And that was a change that we came to because of our scientific understanding. It informed our moral choices. Another example that is even more relevant, though, is consider the case of what happened with embryos over time. The fact of the matter is that this was shocking to me, that humanity didn't actually figure out what sperm did scientifically until 1798, when a guy named Spallanzani in Italy saw sperm fertilize frogs' eggs and dogs' eggs. And I was going, well, that took a long time. But in any case, what happened is, up until that point, the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, had considered probably that quickening, that is life, the soul ensoulment hadn't occurred until after 40 days after conception at that point. It seemed to be the standard procedure. They were not in favor of abortion, but it wasn't a mortal sin at that point. But in 1865, in the light of this new science of conception and understanding what conception was, the church decided to err on the side of caution. And so using the scientific advance of 50 years prior to that or more, the church changed its opinion. Now, with regard to embryos today, embryologists know that somewhere upwards of 80% of all fertilized eggs, all embryos, never develop into babies. They simply leave in the woman's menstrual flow. And I think that it doesn't give us any information morally necessarily, but I do think it raises an interesting question. If God or nature is so profligate with embryos, why do we have to be so careful with them in some sense? It's again, I mean, you have to think about it as it's scientifically informed. I understand the point of view people have that life begins at conception, but if God is throwing away 80% of them himself, why should we be so concerned about them in some sense? And the fact is, as Michael Sandel, who is on the President's Bioethics Council, once put it, look, if in fact, because we know these details of embryology are the case, if we know that this is happening, then why aren't we monitoring every woman's menstrual flow every month and making sure that we save them and put them back? I don't want to make fun of the people in some sense, obviously I do, but but again, our moral choices will be refined and enhanced by our understanding of science. It is not dispositive, but that's the way the tension works. And I think that science over time has in fact helped us understand things like human equality.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wes?
Yeah, I don't think it is actually a scientific controversy when human life begins. A human biological organism begins when fertilization is complete, and if they're ever able to actually clone human embryos, which seems not to have happened now, then that would be an organism, a human organism, would have commenced upon the completion of the cloning process. That, of course, does not settle the issue, but that's what science can tell us. Science can tell us that an embryo, in fact, every embryology textbook does, that I've read, will tell us that a human organism begins upon the completion of fertilization. For the next 8 weeks, it's called an embryo, and after that until birth, it's called a fetus. Now, what are the moral issues involved in these issues? Well, some might say that scientifically we know that in the first 2 weeks, an embryo does not have any kind of cognitive capacity. Has no neurons and so forth, and that is true. Then we can judge whether there is a moral issue involved in destroying those lives or in using those lives as a harvestable crop, and whether or not it is acceptable to create human life as a harvestable crop. But if we can do that to embryos, can we do it to fetuses? Can we create fetuses and gestate them in artificial wombs for organ procurement purposes? Well, that would be legal right now in New Jersey, which has legalized human somatic cell nuclear transfer, has not outlawed implantation of the cloned embryo, and has permitted gestation through the 9th month, only making it a crime if the cloned baby were actually to be born. Now, is that moral to create a fetus and go out 6 months? Science can't tell us that. Ethics has to tell us that. Morality has to tell us that. Philosophy has to tell us that.
Thank you. I'd like to try to address now the question of how we look at scientists, because I think they come to us in sort of two different guises or wearing two different hats. Sometimes they come to us as advocates, as I think was alluded to. They're advocates for a particular line of research, maybe, or at least for funding it, and perhaps we can see that most clearly in the stem cell debate, where they having been a little thwarted by Congress, they very successfully raised $3 billion in the California Stem Cell Initiative. But at other times, they come to us not as single individuals, not as an interest group, but more as committees of dispassionate experts who, through a mechanism like the National Academy of Scientists, have done their very best to bring the most accurate knowledge we have to the issues laid before them. So I'd like to ask this question to all our speakers, but could I ask Chris about the advocacy side? I mean, I think you may have I read you as implying that we should listen to scientists because they're always speaking to us with their National Academy hat on, but quite often they're speaking to us with their advocacy hat on. So how do you tell which hat they're wearing, and wouldn't you make a difference between how you respond to the two hats?
Sure. Well, scientists always want more money. And when scientists are, for example, lobbying for greater funding of research, they are clearly acting purely as advocates, and it's the job of politicians to decide how many taxpayer dollars are going to go to different sorts of research and how many total dollars are going to go to scientific research rather than to other things. This is a completely political decision. And when I talk about the political misuse of science, I do not mean denying scientists as much money as they want. The political misuse of science is distorting the information, attacking the information. So clearly, scientists lobby for some things sometimes, and funding is one of the top ones. Nevertheless, what we need from scientists is also expertise, and the way that you get it if you're a political decision maker is that you gather together some sort of advisory body. The National Academies is certainly one. There are many different mechanisms that have been used to do this. I mentioned earlier the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, which was very credible. And you ask them a question, and you get the best minds, and they deliberate, and they try to give you an answer. And sometimes you have to get your answer quicker because you have to make a decision quicker. But hopefully that's the process that we'll set up. And in that process, you really do want a careful assessment of the science, and you do want to try to keep advocacy out of the responses. That's why the Office of Technology Assessment was so great before the Gingrich Republicans got rid of it. It's because they did not take a stance on what members of Congress should do. Rather, what they said was, if you do this, if Congress would like to do this, the science says this. If Congress would like to do that, the science says that. And what this really shows is, I think, an awareness of an important fact. Science in and of itself never compels a specific policy outcome. So for example, we know that humans are causing global warming, but does that compel Kyoto, or does it compel something slightly more restrictive than Kyoto, or does it compel no action? It's not clear. The science itself will not give you the answer to that.
Well, Chris, when you have a moral question, say stem cell research, however, I mean, even if the scientists put forward a very persuasive case that they can save lives by following embryonic stem cell research, nonetheless, to the extent there's a moral question there, surely there should be oversight of scientists. That's not a decision for scientists to make totally by themselves, I assume.
Oh, no. I mean, our society needs to decide what kind of ethical guidelines govern scientific research. And I think that the scientists themselves certainly are allowed to give input into that process. But they're certainly not the only arbiters of what research is moral and what isn't. There was reference earlier to the National Academies panel, which did make ethical statements. I mean, I'm pretty sure that that wasn't just scientists. I'm sure that they had a lot of ethicists involved in that study as well.
I was going to press Wes on exactly that point. Although you said that we shouldn't listen to scientists on ethical questions.
No, I didn't quite say it that strongly. I said that they certainly have a right to input, but we shouldn't depend on their input.
Okay, well said. But nonetheless, with this committee that Chris has referred to, a committee set up by the National Academy of Sciences to set up ethical standards for doing embryonic stem cell research, which they did because the government, which usually does this, had not done so. So on this committee, there were not only scientists who know a lot about stem cell biology, but there were also a lot of very distinguished medical ethicists. And in the past, there has been, I think, a very fruitful interaction between ethicists and scientists, usually in the form of presidential ethical commissions, and they have always found common ground and come to an agreement, which has sort of served us very well in the past. It seems to me this Academy committee was trying to implement the same steps, and it did in fact come out with ethical guidelines that were broadly accepted by many institutions around the country. So does not a step like that, which is an attempt by scientists to do their best to meet ethical concerns, and which does indeed result in broad consensus, isn't that something which we could and should respect?
I certainly think we should respect it, but it's not determinative, particularly since people like me were not invited to be part of that deliberation. If you want a commission of ethicists to come to a conclusion about an ethical issue, I know who to bring in to come up to one conclusion, and I know who to bring in to come up to another conclusion. That was not a wide open discussion, as far as I know, which involved people would have a ability to influence that decision. Bioethics is a very political and politicized area of discourse in this country. I was actually, I quite agree with Chris that the Office of Technology Assessment should have been maintained. I think we need that kind of, I don't understand why anybody would take it down, because I've relied on it before. I think it's quite important.
It wrote very boring reports.
Well, but good.
They were more readable, I
Sometimes
think,
boring
than
is
some.
good. I think science, though, is in danger of becoming a special interest, particularly because of what Chris talked about, which is the money issue. And in terms of the cloning issue...
Wes, could you conclude quite quickly?
Yes, very quickly. I think the big issue in the next 10 years is going to be a declaration by some scientists that there is a constitutional right to conduct research, and that the very type of regulation that Chris says he supports will be attempted to be found to be unconstitutional.
Well, I'd like to thank our three speakers very much, Chris Mooney, Ron Bailey, and Wes Smith, for very enlightening discussion, and the Smith Family Foundation for sponsoring it.